Thank you for joining us for this next presentation in our historic speaker series. Our presentation this afternoon will be by Karen Humphrey. Karen and her husband Charles were here in Lindsborg. Charles was the pastor at Bethany Lutheran. After that, they moved back to Minnesota. Karen has been part of the Minnesota Historical Society there. So Karen has done a lot of research on different topics. She had presented on Alma Swenson. This presentation is on Alma Luise Olson. So we are excited to have Karen. I will say this as being made possible by a grant through Humanities Kansas. This is a project of Smoky Valley Historical Association in partnership with the Lindsborg Old Mill and Swedish Heritage Museum. So I will turn it over to Karen.
Well, thank you very much, Lenora. And it's absolutely wonderful to be in connection with everyone in Lindsborg. Chuck and I hold those 8.5 years as very, very special years of our lives, living in that very special community. And we tell people about it and they kind of, really, they say. So it's quite wonderful to be back together. So I'd like to begin with a quote by Joan Jensen, who is history professor emerita at New Mexico State University. She writes, "The immigrant experience is still our great American epic. It has a million faces, the faces of men and women, and consideration now to the women's faces and voices and their presence in the American story." So what is the story of one Alma Luise Olson, daughter of Swedish immigrants, and what is her place in the great American epic that we are all part of? Weaving together the story of a person's life, especially a woman's life, is an adventure that takes one down many roads. And I know many of you have been through this too with family genealogy. I had the good fortune of a box of papers, thanks to John and Carol Pearson, who lived in the house that Alma Luise and her family had owned. And I had a book and a subscription to the New York Times digital edition, as well as newspapers.com. So all of those combined helped me do this research about this interesting woman whom I had heard of course, when we moved to Lindsborg, and just got more and more interested as time went along. So here's the research that I found about her. That book that I mentioned, that has a rather academic title called Scandinavia, The Case for Neutrality, opens with a rather interesting story. She recalls a certain conversation before she sailed from New York on her first visit to Sweden in 1927. Here's what Alma Luise writes. "A dinner with friends in Park Avenue, when a daughter of the American Revolution took alarm at my weird and alien-sounding venture of booking on the Gripsholm, which makes port in Gothenburg. Reassuring herself once more of something else that she knew all too well, that I was a compatriot of hers, she asked, 'However, were also your parents born in this country?' And to my negative reply, she murmured sadly, 'Ah, but then you have no ancestors.'" Can you imagine what that must have been like? Well, in truth, Alma Luise had lots and lots of relatives and ancestors in abundance, and she was about to go visit them all. 6 months after that conversation, Alma Luise returned from Sweden with an abundance of material to write substantive articles for the American press. In 1929, she moved to Stockholm, and for the next 10 years, with datelines from Stockholm, Helsinki, Oslo, Copenhagen, and Reykjavik for the New York Times, she reported on arts and history and theater and politics and the literary scene in Scandinavia. And while doing so, she introduced the vast American readership of the nation's largest newspaper to the Nordic countries, which for so many years had been not even above the newspaper headlines. They were not known so much of in those circumstances, in those days. She was an eyewitness to the turbulent years in Scandinavia and on the continent, and she became a pacifist, and for the rest of her life engaged in organizations supporting peace. She is the first American to be awarded Sweden's Royal Medal of Vasa. And she grew up in Lindsborg. The next slide. Thank you. Alma Luise was born March 31st, 1884, on a farm just southeast of Lindsborg to John Eric and Lovisa Matilda Peterson Olson, who emigrated from Örebro and were married November 1, 1872 in Ishpeming, Michigan. In 1879, John bought the farm near Lindsborg, where he moved his family permanently. Well, John became one of the most successful farmers in the region. He and Lovisa Matilda grieved the death of 6 of their 8 children. Only Alma Luise, who is seated there in the center as the youngest child, and her older sister Elin, later pronounced Ellen, would survive beyond the age of 20. And I'm sorry, I don't know which of those older women is Elin. The next slide, please. So I must tell you about this plat map. A few years ago, when Bethany Church and Lindsborg were celebrating the anniversary, I was visiting with Chester Peterson, and he happened to have this plat map. So if you see where the yellow, the black arrow on yellow is, and if you go over to the left to the orange section and you see the name Olson, that's the farm. And then Chester Peterson is pointing out, that's his finger there, and you'll see it on the next, or right next, the next image, that's the school, McPherson District 4, where Alma Luise began her education. It was 1 mile from the farm. The next slide, please. In the spring of 1900, Alma Luise was one of 28 confirmands at Bethany Lutheran Church. The pastor was, of course, Dr. Carl Aaron Swenson, and Alma is seated immediately next to him in this photo. In the autumn of 1901, Alma Luise begins her studies at Bethany College, while earning top grades in Christianity, English, Swedish, German, French, Spanish, Latin, history, and aesthetics. She revived the college newspaper, the Bethany Messenger, and served as its editor. She portrayed both Bassiano and Nerissa in a production of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. She played forward on the first women's basketball team, and one of her teammates became one of her dear friends, Annie Theo Swenson. So here are the 2 of them. Alma Luise is on the left, and Annie Theo on the right. In her senior year, Alma Luise was the only woman of 10 contestants in the W.W. Thomas English Oratory Contest. She won first prize with her speech, The Spirit of Unrest. Alma Luise was among 105 graduates from Bethany College that year on April 29, 1903. 2 others in her class who had also become notable alumni. Annie Theo Swenson, of course, she is the person standing on the right in this photo. Her distinguished career as professor of English, dramatics, and speech, and dean of women at Bethany College spanned more than 40 years. And another classmate was Oscar Bruce Jacobson, who mentored the Kiowa Six while director of University of Oklahoma's Art School, 1915 to 1954. The diplomas for the Bethany College class of 1903 were signed by Dr. Swenson, his last graduating class before his untimely death on February 7th, 1904. The next slide, thank you. Following graduation, Alma Luise taught at McPherson County District 5 until 1905, when she joined the Bethany faculty. She taught English and Spanish, and then she was appointed librarian. And as librarian, she supervised the preparations for the new Carnegie Library, which would open in 1908 and be shared by both college and community. Here is the great crowd of people at the ceremony to lay the cornerstone. The next slide. And here's the completed library where Alma Luise presided. During this time frame, of course, Lindsborg was evolving into such an American community that Teddy Roosevelt made 2 presidential campaign stops. Yet Swedish was still the language at home and at Bethany Church, and created a certain milieu that enlightened her spirit of inquiry. Several professors were recent graduates of old universities and conservatories in Sweden who came to Kansas for the opportunity to teach at this college on the American prairie. They brought an international viewpoint while deepening the Swedish cultural connections. Such professors Olof Grefström studied in Stockholm at the Academy of Fine Arts, where his classmates were the brilliant Swedish artists Anders Zorn and Richard Berg. Karl Lotov studied art in Stockholm and Paris. Hagbard Brasi studied music at Skara and the Royal Conservatory. Sigrid Larin was a grandnephew of the Swedish troubadour Oscar Anfelt, whose tunes Lena Sandel's poetry gave to heart and to mind. Birger Sandzane, of course, taught French and art history, painting and drawing, and studied at Skara and in Stockholm with Zorn and Berg, and he studied in Paris. And Samuel Thorstenberg, born in the Smoky Valley and a Bethany graduate, studied music in Stockholm as well as in England and New York. Several societies on Bethany's campus at that time, such as the Linnean Association, Svea, and Tegnérförbundet, focused on Swedish language and culture. And the Swedish Pavilion from the 1904 World's Fair graced the Bethany College campus as the center for art instruction. This beautiful building was designed by none other than Ferdinand Broberg, the foremost Swedish architect of the day, who even designed the beautiful home of Prince Eugene. Perhaps many of you have been there. That's now an art gallery and an art museum. It's very likely then that living and studying and working in this context suffused Alma with a certain curiosity to see the wider world through Scandinavia, and that Sweden would be her base. In 1909, Alma Luise moved to Chicago and worked on her master's degree in arts, philosophy, and science at the University of Chicago. She lived with other professional women here at the famous Hull House, the famous settlement house, under the direction of one of the most famous of Americans, and that would be Jane Addams. The next slide, please. Jane Addams, whom you see here, was some of the immigrant children nurtured at this Hull settlement house. So women living at Hull House offered night classes to new immigrants in cooking, sewing, and technical skills, and helped them become more integrated into American society. Alma Luise likely taught them how to read and develop their writing skills. Jane Addams, by the way, was a classmate at Rockford College in 1881 of none other than Emmy Carlson Ewald, the great friend of Alma Swenson. And her father, Pastor Erland Carlson, one of the founders of the Augustana Synod, had a summer home outside of Lindsborg. So Emmy, of course, was a great visitor to Lindsborg as well. In 1931, Jane Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American woman so honored. And in 1917, Alma Luise made her way to New York, where she became editor of the Scarsdale Inquirer, the first official newspaper of the Women's Club of Scarsdale, New York. In 1922, Alma Luise becomes a freelance writer and translator, and she collaborated with Victor Oscar Freeberg and Edwin Björkman in the translation of short stories by this man, Prince Wilhelm of Sweden. The short stories were published by E.P. Dutton in the collection Roaring Bones. Prince Wilhelm, the second son of King Oscar II, would be in Lindsborg for the dedication of Presser Hall. Alma Luise's first byline in the New York Times appeared July 11th, 1926, and is the first indication of her writing about Sweden. The headline reads, "Stonecutter is Swedish premier. Carl Ekman, first laborer to attain chief ministry in his land, carries sledgehammer technique into his public speaking." The Times published her review of 6 books between 1926 and 1927. The famous American psychologist Ethel Puffer Howe engaged Alma Luise at Smith College, one of the Ivy League elite, so-called elite colleges, for a research project entitled, or at the Institute of the Coordination of Women's Interests, the special session and college within a college that Ms. Howe set up. So now, on the next slide, Alma Luise corresponds with Ida Tarbell and Dorothy Canfield Fisher and more than 90 other women, leading to the Institute's first publication, a guide that's entitled Freelance Writing as an Occupation for Women. The next slide. Now, at the same time, Alma Luise makes arrangements for her first visit to Sweden. Following that dinner with friends on Park Avenue, where her compatriot said, "I'm sorry, you have no ancestors," Alma Luise sailed from New York on the Gripsholm, and this is her passport photo. She sailed April of 1927 to Gothenburg, and now she visits her cousins and aunts and uncles in such towns as, and I may mispronounce these, forgive me please, Grängesberg, Staldalen, Holmsjön, Bånghammar, Kopparberg, Bångbordalen, Blomensbecken. And while traveling through Skåne, she stopped at Smedstorp to meet the great aunt of Charles Lindbergh, whose successful solo flight in May 1927 had captured the world's adulation. The next slide. Alma Luise came home from that trip to Sweden with considerable material to work on back in New York. She wrote 3 major articles published in the New York Times. The National Geographic here featured her lengthy article, Sweden, Land of the White Birch and White Coal. Her 35-page history and tour guide of Dalarna for the Svenska Trafikförbundet was published in English by Victor Peterson's Bok Industriolog, and she translated Einar Lundberg's 221-page book, Nobile, the narrative of the Swedish Spitsbergen expedition sent in search of the Italian Arctic expedition. And that was a pretty good bestseller, is my understanding. The next slide. Well, in May 1929, Alma Luise sailed again on the Gripsholm for Sweden, where now she will explore the Scandinavian countries from her base in Stockholm. Over the next 10 years, the New York Times published more than 140 of her articles, reports on politics, literature, science, industry, art and art exhibits, industrial and cultural expositions, architecture, history, theater, not only in Sweden, but also in Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland. The next slide. Here you'll see a photo of her passport allowing her travels. Consider the people of those years that Alma Luise met or wrote about and witnessed. These Nordic people, museums, books, and movement we hold dear today. So Karin Bergou Larsen, you know that she's the wife and really created the scene for her husband, Carl Larsen, to paint. Selma Lagerlöf, Emma Zorn, Sigrid Undset, Karen Blixen, Anna Anker, Louise and Ottilia Adelborg, Fanny Breit, Harriet Backer, Marie Kreuer, Märta Moos Fjätterström, Hilma af Klint, Carl Milles, who invited her for tea more than once, Prince Eugene and Hugo Alfvén, Edvard Munch, Ferdinand Broberg, Knut Hamsun, Wilhelm Moberg, Gustav Vigeland. She reviewed books that these people had written and paintings that they had first exhibited. It's an amazing milieu of people that she knew and saw in person. Now, I'd like to read a sample of her writing, just so you get an idea. And I'll read another sample a bit later. But this one is from, the date line is Oslo, December 21st, 1930. The headline, News of Art in Wintry Norway. An artist should paint for you the somber browns and grays shifting from the silvery hoarfrost of a sunlit morning to leaden skies full of tempest. Here's a miniature world of fantastically elongated shadows, even at noon. The sun prescribes a briefer and briefer arc on a far horizon of the foothills of the fjells that encircle Oslo. It drops out of sight. Twilight comes swiftly. Gales have stripped the trees, and they are modernistic in their barrenness. The branches of the oaks have the queer and twisted lines that Per Krogh delights to draw. Up in the foothills, the wind seizes the pines and spruces and makes a fresco of the landscape with the bold, broad brush work of Edvard Munch. This whole world of the North is riding once more toward a seasonal Ragnarok, the winter solstice. But the mood in Norway is one of adventure. The keynote of Oslo one catches in the questioning upward lilt of musical voices heard on the streets. During the conflicted years leading to World War II, Alma Luise's credentials as a journalist allow her to become an eyewitness to peace efforts in Geneva and Stockholm. From Heidelberg, she writes, "The streets had been crimson with the swastika flag, and at dawn, I had been awakened by the sound of marching feet of men in uniform." In Italy, she writes, "Mussolini is calling young men to take the colors for the Ethiopian campaign." From Florence, she writes, "Anxious mothers and fathers scanned the bulletins that summoned young men, and despite all official assurances to the contrary, there were no visible traces of public enthusiasm." Her lengthy article in the Times describes the Baltic countries pursuing a policy of peace with the Scandinavian countries. Now, with Europe roiling and the impending Nazi invasion of Denmark and Norway, Alma Luise returns to New York on February 14, 1939, and is never able to get a passport to return to Scandinavia. You can see her expression of worry and wariness and fright, if you will, when she's coming home. This photo by Blackstone Studios. Lippincott announced the publication of her book on January 3rd, 1940, Scandinavia, The Background for Neutrality. The book had two printings, and you see on the right, the new cover for the second printing, Scandinavia, The Struggle for Peace, with the new chapter on the Nazi invasion. She dedicates her book to the unconquerable spirit of a North, where traditions of liberty, law, and order are nestled in hidden valley, on lofty crag, in forest stillness. Her book is reviewed in every major newspaper across the country. On April 10th, 1940, the St. Louis Dispatch prints an excerpt from her chapter on Norway on their opinion page, and their front page has the headlines that reports the battle for Norway and the Nazi takeover. While the war rages in Europe, the next slide, Alma Luise is in New York and writing of Sweden. She writes to the American Swedish Monthly and publishes her series of articles, Envoys of Goodwill, reminding Swedish Americans at least of Frederica Bremer, Jenny Lind, and Archbishop Nathan Soderblom, who visited America. In a memoir of her visit with Selma Lagerlöf here at Mårbacka, Alma Luise writes, "Though Ms. Lagerlöf never visited the United States, she fondly recalled reading about the American immigrant experience in a Prairie Junges Fundringer, stories by Anna Olson that we're all familiar with, the daughter of Pastor Olaf Olson, the founder of Lindsborg." The next slide. Now, I have to tell you, 2 summers ago, I was in Selma Lagerlöf's library at Mårbacka with a small group of others, and I, while listening to our guide, was quickly searching her shelves up and down. So the shelves behind her, and then there's shelves that she's facing on the other side, embracing the windows. So I looked and looked as quickly as I could. I didn't touch anything. I tried to find the book. I was so engrossed in searching that the guide came back from the next room and pleasantly, though firmly, reminded me that I must keep up with the group. So I regret not finding that book, but it must be in an archive of hers somewhere. I must read to you now another excerpt on the next page, please, of on the death of Alma Luise, on the death, I'm sorry, the death of Selma Lagerlof in March 1940. She provides such a sense of place for this beloved author's life work. Here's what she writes. Under the sunlit dome of deep azure skies, springtime comes tiptoeing back to the north, to Sweden, to the Lake District of its central province of Värmland, to Mårbacka, a stately manor house with lemon walls and dark slate roof that has become one of the outstanding literary landmarks of the country. The coral of the bursting buds of the white birches is shifting rapidly through a faint yellowish tinge to a tender, cool emerald. In the background, the hoary spruces and pines are chasing off their burden of wintry snows. But this year, as the wind begins anew its song of life, while it strums the lacy tops of the birches or picks up the deeper alto in the murmuring evergreens, its chant also becomes an elegy, not sorrowful, but triumphant, in memory of the departed mistress of Mårbacka. Selma Lagerlof's own saga has ended. I think that's a beautiful tribute to her. On December 2nd, 1940, Alma Luise was the guest of honor at a luncheon by the American Scandinavian Foundation for 90 people at the Park Lane Hotel in New York. The Honorable Wolmar F. Boström, Minister of Sweden to the United States, came up from Washington, D.C., and on behalf of King Gustav V, presented Alma Luise with the Royal Medal of Vasa in gold. He stated this way, for the valuable work she has done in spreading knowledge of Sweden, its art and literature in the United States. The New York Times, among others, all published reports of her honor. And it notes that Birger Sandzane and Margaret Sandzane were in attendance from her hometown. And I must tell you, before I forget, that this medallion is now in the archives of Bethany Church, where John and Carol Pearson wanted it to be, and also an article that I wrote for the Swedish American Historical Society Journal about Alma Luise, and also the papers that I have. John and Carol kindly loaned them to me because I was so interested in reading them. And Rick Torgerson was visiting Lindsborg. He visited John and Carol. They gave him the box. Rick Torgerson brought it up to Minnesota, where he was living at the time, transferred it to my car, and I kept them for a few years. And John, when I was done with them, and I told John, what would you like me to do with these? And he said, please give the boxes to the Old Mill Museum. And so they are now in the care of the Old Mill Museum for further research. And I hope someone continues. Thank you. The next slide. After the war, Alma Luise becomes a frequent observer of the United Nations during the first general sessions that are held in Flushing, New York. Alma Luise is likely seated here in the balcony in this photo, or behind the pillars that you see on the upper left. She wrote about this experience to her family, and she just happened to meet the Swedish ambassador, who asked how things were in Lindsborg. The next slide, please. It's interesting to note that Alma Luise spoke the language of the first two secretaries general, Trygve Lie of Norway and Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden. And here's Trygve Lie welcoming Dag Hammarskjöld in early April 1953 as his successor at the UN. And you know, when I was doing this research and learned about Alma Luise and her interest in the United Nations, I asked Bruce Karstedt if he would check with his colleagues at the Hammarskjöld archive in Uppsala to see if there might be a letter from one Alma Luise Olson. So Bruce checked, and there was not a letter. For some reason, I can't help but think that she wrote him or Trygve Lie a letter suggesting what they should do for world peace. Not to be found as yet, anyway. The next slide, please. And I need to say thank you to Naomi Durant for this photo that she sent to me. In the autumn of 1946, Alma Luise returned home to Kansas, to the Smoky Valley and this eternally beautiful landscape that she knew as a child. And that is the beauty of a photo. She moves in with her sister Ellen at 328 North First Street, the large house that their father built almost a half century earlier. It was in this house that John and Carol Pearson kept that box of papers safe and loaned to me for research. Next to the mailbox on the front porch, she installs a large wooden box to receive her daily copy of the New York Times. She held salons in this house, substantive discussions in her home and on issues of the day. The next slide, please. Alma Luise was appointed assistant professor of English at Bethany College and gives leadership to study groups discussing peace. And she established an active chapter of the United Nations, and the students held a United Nations rally. In 1961, she coached Bethany students who played such leading figures of the era at the UN, like Kennedy, Castro, Nasser, Khrushchev, and Hammarskjöld. And she continued to write. She even wrote a drama on the road to peace, a conversation in 3 scenes, and it's the Library of Congress that owns the only copy of that work. The next slide. Well, Alma Luise Olson's own life came to an end on April 25th, 1964, at the age of 80. And this is the monument at Elmwood Cemetery for the John and Luise Olson family. The New York Times publishes her obituary, citing her years as a special correspondent in Scandinavia, praises her book for its understanding of Scandinavia, the awarding of her medal of the Vasa Medallion, and that she was an expert linguist, internationalist, and supporter of the United Nations. The obituary noted that she lived alone in Lindsborg and had no immediate survivors. So here is the marker for her sister Ellen, who died in 1953. And the next slide shows the marker for Alma Luise, buried in Elmwood Cemetery with her parents and 7 siblings. There were no descendants of this family. The next slide, please. So, what to make of Alma Luise Olson, March 31st, 1884, till April 25th, 1964. She was a young woman who was so confident in her intellect and her skills and her ability that she believed she could do whatever she needed to do, wherever she wanted to go, to follow her curiosity. And all of this, I would remind you, is before women's suffrage, which occurred in 1920. She certainly had a role model in Alma Lind Swenson, and perhaps she was even named after her, I'm not sure. Alma Lind Swenson, you know well, the community leader, the founder of the Bethany Oratorio Society, the exceptional hostess, one of the women who created a community of civilized values. And she was probably influenced too by Carl Aaron Swenson, who believed anything was possible. Alma Luise was a new generation, part of the new generation of Americans born of immigrants. She showed how far American women had come in one generation. And she wanted to discover for herself the land of her parents and those who made her community, Bethany Church, Bethany College, and Lindsborg, and what it was. She brought to the American conscience Scandinavia at a critical time in history. And she promoted peace, understanding, cooperation. In her will, she established a fund to be Bethany Church to be spent on interchurch education and programs promoting world peace. Additional gifts were given to establish a scholarship for international students at Bethany College. And at the end of her will, she states this: with all my friends, named or unnamed, I share my faith in the divine values around us and my gratitude for the spiritual grandeur of existence. Each passing year has, for myself, added profound depths to the mystery and miracle of life and death. And that's Alma Luise Olson, as far as we know. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Karen, for a great presentation. Betty, if you want to stop the recording, we'll then open it up for questions. Stop my share. Are you still there, Betty? So, okay, we will open it up for questions. So, any questions, comments? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm Peggy Weddle. I actually was related to Alma Luise. My mom is Catherine France. My dad was Carl France.
Okay.
And I
How
see.
How are you related, Peggy?
Okay, well, you'll have to tell me, but my great grandfather, Francis Johnson, was a cousin to John Eric Olson, Alma Luise's father.
Okay, got it. Very
Okay,
good. Thank
so
you.
whatever that is.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about her parents, John and Luise. Do we know anything else about them besides they lost a lot of children in their youth?
No, I was not. I did not find anything else about them in particular. Although Alma Luise writes home to them, but I would say that in the letters, that the papers that are at the Smoky Hill Archives, there is a bunch of letters tied up with a white string from Sweden. And they're not translated, but I would suggest, if you perhaps would like to find out more, they could be in those letters.
Okay,
They
sounds
were
very
not,
interesting.
yeah, they were not in the time frame that I was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband graciously translated some of the other letters, some of the letters that Alma Luise wrote to her parents from Swedish. So I did not ask him to do this other group of letters, but they should be there, tied up with that string.
Okay, thank you. That's
Thank
very
you.
helpful.
And I tried to call your sister, I think, and she never returned my call, and maybe it's because I was living away from Lindsborg at the time. But I'd always be interested if she or you or anyone in the family had something of Alma Luise. There must have been an auction or something. And that would
Yeah,
be so interesting to know. And I'd like to know. I don't want it, of course, but I just
right.
like to see it.
My sister Judy, I don't know if you were trying to get a hold of Judy or Susan, but Judy, I believe, has a painting that was in my folks' house, in our growing up time, by Alma Luise. And it's a nice, large oil painting, it looks like, and it's of wheat shocks from Kansas.
Okay.
Beyond that, I'm not aware of any items that the family or somebody would have retained or acquired.
Okay. If you ever find out, let me know, because I would love to see it. It would be really interesting.
I do remember seeing the books or a book by Alma Luise in the bookshelf, though.
Okay, and that maybe was the book that she wrote, Scandinavia.
Mm-hmm. I think
Yep.
you're right.
Yeah, it's very interesting to read, and it's kind of like a tour of each of those countries and their history and their values at that time, published in 1940.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember her. I did meet her. I was with my mother and we ran into her probably more than once, but because she died in 64. I was born in 53. And so I wasn't very old. And I think I had just recently maybe seen parts of The Wizard of Oz.
Ah.
And so when we met her, I asked my mom if she was the witch.
Oh, because she
Because
always
she
wore
was-
black.
She
Is
was
that-
all dressed in black, and I
Yeah.
feel like it was just from head to toe. And she was a very stern-looking woman. And although my cousin Mary Jane France, said that she had met her and several times, and that she was a very sweet woman.
Mhm.
So I was glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think she probably didn't suffer fools. And someone told me, and I don't remember who, this is a long time ago, when I first heard about her, that she would hold these salons and you were invited and you better have something to contribute.
Mm,
I mean,
mhm,
something intelligent, intellectual. This is
mhm,
not a gossip sort of thing. She
mhm.
wanted serious discussion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Very, very, very nice presentation.
Thank you. Would someone remind me, and this name has escaped me, that the longtime secretary at Bethany Church. I can see her.
Charlotte Turnstrom?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So Charlotte told me one time that she would meet Alma Luise on the sidewalk, and she always had a lovely fragrance.
Hmm.
Or maybe her perfume was from Paris or something. But she always had a lovely fragrance, Charlotte said. So another example of very small detail. We don't have much.
Right. Charlotte's also a relative.
Oh, yes, that's right. I remember that. Yes, thank you. I remember that.
Did Alma's sister accomplish a lot in life also?
You know, I read some of the letters that she wrote, Naomi, to Alma, and Alma had written to her. And I believe that that she was sort of at the home front and maybe watched after their father. Their mother had died earlier. She was quite active in the Scandinavian embroidery, textiles, sewing that was going on. So she was active that. I think she was active in the community in a quiet sort of way. But there's not much about her that I've uncovered.
Well, Alma just sounds so exceptional. So it was a great presentation. I appreciate all your research.
Thank you, Naomi. And again, thank you for that lovely photo that you sent to us.
Sure.
Okay, any other questions or comments? The last of this series of our historic speaker series for this season will be Marla Sue Holmquist. That was scheduled for the second Saturday of March, which I think was March 9th. Marla Sue is going to have to reschedule that, and we have not, it was scheduled for March 8th. We have not set a date for that. I'm hoping that will happen yet in March, probably later in the month. So we will be sending out notices and posting that on our Facebook and social media. So Marla Sue's presentation will be about Amelia Rabinius. Amelia was the head of the Sloyd department at Bethany College in the early 1900s, and Sloyd would be like handworks. I know that they did a lot of Marla Sue has documented some pieces of furniture where they have done wood burning and different things like that. So I think that's going to be a very interesting presentation. So we will let everyone know for the date that will be rescheduled. Also, if you have ideas for other presentations, I'm looking at for next season, we will be taking April and May off because that is a busy time for us here at the museum. And then we will start again, hopefully in August with presentations on a monthly basis. So if you've got ideas of topics or people that you would like to see, drop me a line, let me know. I'm looking for ideas. So anyway, again, thank you everyone for attending. And
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.